welcome to Art in the Raw, Conversations with Creative People. Tonight, I'm excited to introduce you to Rebecca Kunz, owner of Tree of Life Studio, a full-time artist. If this is your first time watching, you might be wondering who I am. In a nutshell, I'm somebody that's been in love with art and music my entire life. I've now been working in the professional gallery world for about 15 years now, and I started Art in the Raw about halfway through 2020 to keep people connected and inspired. So if you see value in that, consider subscribing. But in the meantime, I'm excited to introduce you to Rebecca. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining. And where are you this evening?
In my home studio in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
We both went to the College of Santa Fe, but at different times. So we did not cross paths there. These days, you do a bit of painting, a bit of printmaking.
Mixed media, printmaking, interested more lately in monotype, block printing. I've kind of developed my own technique with monotype, painting, watercolor, pen and ink, graphite, pretty much anything I can get my hands on.
Spent a little time with your website. I also see you've had some projects where you've painted on rocks and recently a mural or two. So as long as you can create something, you're into it.
That's right. We had our house built and we helped with a lot of the building process 2 years ago. That became my art project as well, and that was part of the reason why I wanted to build a home. A lot of what I did in the home was create handmade reliefs and little details around the home that have my touch. There's more to come. That's also something I'm interested in, is working in handmade elements into any and everywhere, into architecture, into walls. I created handmade ceramic, I guess you could call them tiles, although they're not square. And for each of my daughter's rooms, I created a tile with symbology that was about who they were. And each of those got embedded into the walls of their bedrooms when we were building the house. So there's a lot of that integrated into my home, and that's something I'm more interested in the future as well.
Well, I really love that story. Why does art just need to be limited to a piece of paper or a canvas and not live in it? And that's amazing for your daughters. I actually have a painting that is up in my house currently that was in my bedroom when I was a little kid. And I really feel like it was very influential. You started Tree of Life Studio in 2007, as I understand it. So is it kind of safe to say the business started when you were pregnant with your first daughter?
I was working on it before that, but that's when I opened my business.
It's kind of like, okay, this is happening.
It's happening. It's official. No pressure.
Yeah, none at all. You did that in 2007. I don't know how many years that is, but you're well on your path.
I've been really an artist my whole life and painting since 19, and I'm 46 now.
So I am curious. You'd started off as a photography major and then transitioned over. I'm kind of curious about that.
That was an interesting moment. I love and adore photography, and I still do to this day. I love taking photographs. But there was something in me that wanted something a little more raw, something that was truly coming from me, not something I found. Photography started feeling a little bit like I was like a found object, or I had this very intuitive sense that I needed to switch over into something that was much more purely only coming from me. And it was not easy. I struggled for a long time with painting and finding my way and learning how to paint and how to even make things look like I wanted them to look, and images that would come to me in my head, bringing those into true form and to life was quite a challenge. The figure drawing has always come pretty easily, and I felt confident in that way, but the abstract nature of painting that I'm more drawn to that took a lot of effort to get to a place where I felt comfortable and confident in my skills and happy with the work I was doing. Glad I stuck with it, even through a lot of bad art that I made in college and beyond.
That's part of the process, right? You've got to, I think, make what doesn't work before you figure out what does work.
That is
Um,
so true. I had many frustrating moments, and many moments I could have given up, and I know a lot of people can relate to that. Any career path, anything that's meaningful in life, it doesn't seem to me that it should come easily. I have paid my dues, and I truly believe that's part of most anything that's worth doing in this life. It takes a lot of work and dedication, and it's not easy a lot of times, and that gives us that grit to keep going. Otherwise, someone that something might have fallen into their lap easily, they don't own it as much, and it's not integrated into their soul in the same way, I believe. And I've experienced that with things that do come more easily to me. It doesn't have the same weight or meaning.
but overall, you have a very recognizable style. Can you talk a little bit about the journey that you took to cultivate that style?
The style has come in different waves and bits and pieces. As I began finding my own voice, as I would say, that was probably some years after college, after studying painting and truly finding things that would work, that I could actually paint. And I tried a lot of things. When things really started coming together for me, that was after I really dedicated myself to my business. I committed to myself and my business, certain things and certain goals, and at that point I found my voice through, like you said, also through painting a lot of things that didn't work, but and through exploration and asking a lot of questions, and abstraction has always called to me. I'm deeply inspired by petroglyphs. Diving more recently into mythology and what that means to us as humans on a very basic level, as humans, not so much the mythology that we always find in books, but our own personal narratives, our own mythology that we create in this world. And I've been exploring that a lot, and exploring it through the different genres of painting and printmaking. And sometimes they have overlapped, and sometimes they have felt like they're separate, but they have informed each other. My printmaking, my block printing in particular, being much more simple and almost crude sometimes, as opposed to some of my paintings being a little more complex, a lot more complex. And it has been interesting to me to compare them over the years and see them change and grow, because I'm inspired by both in very different ways. But also I've unconsciously noticed in the last few years how they have been merging together more. The two styles, the more primitive printmaking style, and the more complex layering of colors and textures through painting. And I'm really enjoying how they're overlapping more, and that's a series of work I'm just now starting on. I'm seeing more integration, and it's not exactly conscious, but it's something that I'm noticing is happening.
I love your blog, by the way. I love all the stories that you've written about the art, but I also love that you've included in that recipes and in talking about creativity.
Mm-hmm.
I find creativity extends into all things, kind of like it's not just on a canvas, it's on a tile on the wall, but it's also on the dinner plate. And so I love that you kind of mix all of that together into the blog.
Thank you. And I did do a lot more of that in the earlier years when I started my blog, and it's evolved as many blogs have and changed. And there have been some moments where I've thought, oh, maybe I need to take some of those old blogs down, and because my blog has changed, but I've decided to leave it because it's a whole picture of who I am and have become, and who I was and still am. But yes, art in everything, everywhere.
Kind of helps paint a larger picture of who is the artist, which is something I'm always curious about. So whether it's a particular pizza crust or an amazing story about coyotes. I think it's all connected. On a recent post, you had mentioned coyotes as muses. We see some of those coyotes in recent paintings. Can you tell us a little more about the coyotes and those tales?
Spring of 2020, the world started shutting down. I'm a runner and I have a favorite trail that I visit. It's a part of town in Santa Fe that's more out on the plains where the coyotes often are. I've learned, depending on the time of year, late afternoon or evening, at dusk, that's the time I like to be out. And it's also the time when the coyotes are out. It's their territory. At this time, I was beginning to work on this series for this show that I knew was coming in a year and a half from that time. I was reading and learning a lot about Cherokee mythology and the creation story. And at the same time, these coyotes were, I felt, accompanying me on my run. And I just started to form this relationship with them that I really learned to love and cultivate. So the coyotes, as I'm out on the trail, and anyone who's been around coyotes, you know their call is very distinct, but sometimes they would be off to the side, and sometimes they would be on both sides of me, sometimes far away, sometimes quite close. I started listening to them, and I feel that we have a relationship with animals if we choose to listen and cultivate that relationship. And they have a lot to tell us, and we have a lot to learn from them. And so these coyotes, as I was doing this deep dive into mythology, they started speaking to me, and I began to ask for visions for my work as I was creating it. I have often noticed as a creative adult that the ideas for my paintings often come to me in consistent ways. It's often when I'm moving my body, when I'm out in nature, obviously when we're inspired by something beautiful around us or something we've heard, a song, someone has told us something that stirs our spirit. And I started noticing that as I was out running and on the trail, these visions were coming to me regularly. And so these coyote voices started working their way into my paintings, and I really fell in love with them and their personalities and their calls, and they started working their way into my unconscious mind, also in my dream world. And as I was studying the creation story, fell in love with that story as well. My creative process is part of these visions. In this moment of creative inspiration, I had all these visuals of coyotes falling from the sky, but then I would also often see them falling back up, and it was a really poignant moment for me in time that whole spring. And so I would often go home and write down my visions, and that's part of my creative process also, is to write down my ideas. So the consistency was there with these ideas and the visuals and my love for these animals, and I just started to ask more directly and pray. And that is also part of my creative process I have cultivated. And I ask for guidance and stories directly more now. That is not something I did before that, and it's something that I learned to really love. That asking has given me a lot, and I have learned to love that relationship with my creative process.
Do you think the act of asking causes you to listen more?
It does, exactly. And there's a listening, there's an asking and a response and a listening that happens. I think it's important that as an adult I've learned. I believe in asking and speaking things out loud, writing things down, acknowledging things we're grateful for, things we're thankful for, not directly asking for specifically things that we want, tangible things in this world, but as a form of prayer, and asking for what we feel like we need, the path to get there anyway. It's really quite amazing how the answers do come in really unusual and unexpected ways, how they can. And I feel it's really important to say things out loud, or in whatever way that means to you, whether it's writing it down or acknowledging it somehow.
I think writing is really kind of an interesting aspect of visual arts. Some artists do it, some artists don't, but then there's always that, how do you incorporate it?
As I was forming this series, I was actually not sure I was going to tell the stories behind the pieces. Traditionally, it's the viewers, they make their own story up
Mhm.
about the work. And I love that about art. Each piece can mean a different thing to each different person that views it, that it's an interaction. But in this case, it felt important to tell the stories that I was experiencing and the questions I was asking with this particular body of work. It became an integral part of it.
In this case, even though you've put it out there, this is the story, there's still enough left in there for the viewer to have their own, maybe not story, I mean maybe, but their own connection
Mhm.
to the actual pieces.
Thank you. My hope.
Generally, I just love all of your work. In having lived in Santa Fe in the Southwest since the late 90s, there's something about the coyotes and the ravens that is relatable. Maybe there's this larger story, and there's your story, and there's the mythology, but then there's also my own personal connection to, I see, say, a coyote, for example, and then I have my own memories of coyotes and what that means to me. So I think that's kind of the best of both worlds. And so another thing I'm typically interested in is the way artwork is disseminated. And in 2022, there's so many different ways. I specifically visited your booth at that art show. I scoped out your booth on the Instagram page. I was like, okay, I'm going there. But I didn't realize you were the artist also responsible for those cards I'd been buying over the years. So it was kind of this cool moment. I was like, oh, wait, but you're also this person. In that moment, it all made sense. It was like, oh, I already know you. I had been buying your cards around Santa Fe for years. There's probably one or two in the room I'm in right now.
I love that story. It
I
was my first mission when creating my business, to create art that was something that, for one, that I could create with a baby at home, something that wouldn't take months to finish a piece, and something that felt accessible, and something where I could reproduce the work, my paintings. That was the beginning of my business, was just the cards for the first 8 years. And that felt really like something sustainable for me, having babies at home and working from home, that I could do that.
And I think that's part of making art as a career a sustainable thing. Not everyone out there can go buy one of your original paintings,
Mhm.
but you can buy the cards. You also have prints, and the block prints are all pretty affordable as well. But just generally, in terms of an art business, having a range of different things that you've made that are all part of that puzzle of the
Yeah.
business.
I have met people around town, become friends, or they know me in some way, and then they realize that I'm the person that has been making those cards that they've been buying for their loved ones. And that's kind of a common story because it is a small community.
But that said, I was looking at your website, and there's a pretty extensive list of commercial businesses where you can go and buy. I don't know if it's mostly the cards or prints as well, but it is not limited to New Mexico.
And I would like the market to be larger or more extensive, but I haven't put a whole lot of energy into marketing outside of where I am. But
In terms of way work is disseminated, you've shown in some various galleries, but you also kind of have the freedom to be pretty self represented, and you have your website. There's also the Etsy page, the blog, you have some videos up on YouTube. You're out there, both virtually and
mhm.
in the physical world, which I feel like we've only really started noting the difference between those things maybe in the past few years. So, in terms of getting the website up, the Etsy page, what has that whole experience been like for you personally?
My website came first and it's evolved and it's a lot prettier than it used to be, thank goodness. I got on Etsy pretty quickly after that. I didn't set up my website shop though until I guess it's been 3 or 4 years, but I did have my website and my blog for a while from the beginning. And that has been a journey. In my experience, it's not easy to sell a lot of things online. The main issue being you have to find, your audience has to find you, and there's a large pool of people to choose from. And a couple of things that have helped me are I became a New Mexico True certified artist, and from there they have promoted my website. That a lot of my traffic comes from that and from my mailing list that I have created. And Etsy separately, that took some time. I didn't realize early on how much I didn't know and why I wasn't getting sales on Etsy in the very beginning when I started. But more recently, I took a class on Etsy, how to run an Etsy shop successfully, and that helped me greatly. There's a lot more to it than I had realized. There's a range of important things, but one, your photography of your products has to be very high quality, natural lighting, beautiful photographs. You need to represent your work well, and then also SEO. Understanding how SEO works on Etsy in particular, I learned a lot about that. And since then, I've been implementing all those practices that I learned from taking the class, and that has helped immensely. And then I also have certain products that particularly sell well online, and I have learned what sells well and what didn't sell so well, and I've learned a lot. It is a trick to find an audience online. Etsy has its own audience that's built in, which helps. But if you just have a freestanding website and a shop, that is its own art form, and that could be a full-time job for me if I chose to do that. And without the traffic that is brought in through New Mexico True and through my newsletter, and a lot of the traffic comes from people that find me either on Instagram or know my art through my buying my cards. They go directly to my website, but I don't get a huge amount of organic traffic other than that, and that is, I think, a struggle for a lot of people. And I simply have not put the time into the SEO for that. But I love that I can be my own person, especially on my own website, and sell my work online.
It's easier to have a website anymore with the template based websites and all of that. So as artists, we have all the tools to get ourselves out there. Like you said, how do you drive traffic to that website? And then there are websites like Etsy where there's lots of makers within that website, but even within that website, there's so many makers. How do you stand out? So it seems like taking that class was really valuable. Where did you end up finding that?
It's a women's small business entrepreneur organization. It was an in-person class in town, but there are many online classes that I have heard of since then that would be wonderful as well.
I'm always excited to share resources like that. As part of my pre-conversation research, I did go through as the website, but also the Etsy page. And I'd noticed for most of the images up there, you'd posted at least 3 or 4, maybe even 5 images of each piece. I don't know if that was covered in that class, but I know for a lot of makers, it's like, okay, this is a 1D thing. So like, how do you even post more than one image of each piece? Your solution was you had the whole piece, but then there was also a video and then maybe some close-up images of it. Little things like that are maybe not even obvious, but helpful in having the potential buyer think, okay, I'm doing this.
Absolutely. I've learned so much from the Etsy seller community and the Etsy community. They do a lot of outreach to their sellers so that people like me understand how to be successful, and that is one really important thing. They say use all of the photographs that they allow you to post, and I think it's like 12, I want to say. They really encourage you to show different angles, show the product, not just, if it's a painting, not just show one image of just the image of the painting, but what does the painting look like on a wall? What does it, a mock-up of it, actual painting framed. If it's a note card, showing it in use. So that might not resonate with all artists or purists. My main goal from the beginning of my business was to be able to create my own work from my heart and sell it and make a living, make my own living. And so at some point I became more comfortable with that and selling my reproductions, selling note cards and prints. And I've actually moved more in recent years into selling handmade originals, but a lot of my money that keeps me afloat is from the reproductions, and part of that is just being comfortable selling that and photographing it, and I've gotten much more comfortable with that. And a lot of photography is key in anything, because if you're expecting someone to buy something online without seeing it in person, they need to have a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like, what it actually is, and what you can do with it.
So that photography background coming into play, being helpful.
It is. Although I would say for anyone that doesn't have that, don't let that stop you. Just get your phone. If you have a good modern phone, most phones can do everything. Go to a window with bright natural light, indirect light, and find that sweet spot of what that light is and photograph in a simple, very, very simple background, whether it be white or gray or whatever color works with your work, and stick to that formula. Find a formula that works and stick to it, but it's all about natural light, that bright indirect light, not direct. And it's really quite simple once you learn how to do it.
Man, photography sure has changed since we were at the College of Santa Fe. There was no fancy cell phone with the 12 plus megapixel camera and the app.
And we would photograph things and then we would send them off to the lab. Or if you were a photography student, you'd go to the lab and then you would be surprised by the images you found. And it was mysterious and not instantaneous. And we had to wait and not know if we took any good photographs at all.
Still plenty of people exploring those analog processes and letting themselves be surprised by that. But for the more commercial application of photographing your work to be sold online, I think the digital technology is a little bit better for that.
For that purpose.
Another thing I was kind of curious about with the photography background and the block prints, the printmaking processes, I feel like there's the connection. Photography informs it. Do you agree?
I could see that, definitely. And I hadn't ever really thought of that until you mentioned that, but when you say that, it really resonates, especially black and white photography, which was what I was doing. Very simple, and the relief block printing that I'm doing oftentimes is very simple and black and white.
In the block prints specifically, you're kind of carving your negative.
Oh, right.
Which prints a positive.
Yes, there's the foreground and the background and the positive space, negative space, exactly like photography.
Is there anything that you collect?
That is an interesting question. I am a little bit obsessively minimalist, almost maybe to a fault, because I can't stand clutter. I do collect plants. That is something I love. And I would love to collect more art. I've begun collecting treasures over the last more recent years of artists that I love. Don't have a whole lot of wall space for as many artists as I would like to collect.
Is there any artist, living or dead, blue chip or local emerging, if you could just all of a sudden have one of their pieces, who that might be?
That's a good question. Maybe a Picasso. My first choice, some of his really simple black and white drawings. I love the art that's coming out of Oaxaca, the very simple, primitive printmaking styles that I'm seeing. One artist that I particularly love has her work in a local gallery called Hecho e Mano. on Upper Canyon Road, and her last name is Morac, M-O, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, M-O-R-A-C, Gabriella. I love her work. I'd love to own one of her prints, which I will probably go and buy one of these days. I just bought a sculpture from a dear friend, Lisa Smith, who's a local ceramic artist. I told her when I bought her piece, I felt like I just bought a Picasso because it's so brilliant. Some of my dear friends are my favorite artists.
So if you could travel in time backwards or forwards, do you know where you would go?
That's such a good question. There's so many places, but I think if I were just to pick, the first one that pops into my mind would be my people's homeland here in the US. I have a very vivid dream that sometime when I had young children came to me, and in the dream I was flying over my ancestral homeland, which would have been for the Cherokee people, which is part of my heritage. It would have been in the North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee area. In my dream, I was flying over my ancestral homelands, and it was a feeling like nothing else. You see the village and the trails and the people living in this communal village life, and the feeling I had made me long for that, wherever that may be, that feeling of anywhere in the world where we lived in more of a tribal society. I think I would go back to any of those places. I spent some time in Zimbabwe in my early 20s, and very similar to my dream, the experience I had staying in a village, the feeling of that community being held by a tribal community, even though I was not part of it, was unlike anything that I experience in this modern life in the US. And that's what I would go back to, that particular feeling in my spirit.
Say there was a time machine involved. Is there a particular date you would type in there?
I guess I'd say pre-industrialization, just to know what was important, how we lived in that simple way just before the dawn of change.
I'm also curious about other general inspirations. When you're making your imagery or even just thinking about it, is music part of that practice? Are you listening to something, or is it more of a quiet space?
I'm almost always listening to something, and that wasn't always that way. There was a time when I would get my CD player out and play CDs, but now it's much more Pandora and Spotify. I love a lot of genres of music, more contemporary singer-songwriters in the US and beyond. Jenny Lewis, not sure how to pronounce it, Benee, Benee. My daughters were listening to it, and I was so very inspired by that. I wouldn't have heard of that artist if it weren't for my daughters. Darling Side, a recent band. My first true love is Americana, folk art, John Prine, Gene Ritchie, the Carter family, and so much world music. My love for African music and Afropop.
It's kind of amazing the broad range of music we have access to anymore. And in particular with a lot of like algorithm based music streaming options where we can be introduced to music we didn't even know about. And then you mentioned your daughters.
Other artist I just heard tonight, I have three daughters, and they were playing this song that was pretty raw and maybe even something I wouldn't necessarily approve of, but and I asked who it was, and I think it was Billie Eilish. I didn't think I liked pop music that much, but I guess I've surprised myself. And I'm not sure I want my kids to know what she's singing about, but I liked what I heard.
Is there a specific way you think your daughters might have influenced your art making practice?
I'm sure they have. Like so many of us, when we see specifically our own children's artwork, we just think, I can't believe you created this masterpiece. My favorite periods of art is when they were 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. That really crude, simple art that just comes without any inhibition. In that way, I'm constantly inspired by them, and they do give me feedback, and that helps to inspire me. And they're always looking over my shoulder and wanting to know what I'm doing, and their feedback does help me inform me and inspire me. I'll sometimes ask them, like today I was working on a piece and I said, what do you think is happening in this relief print that it was working on? And it was really fun to hear what they thought it was about and what they saw. And I said, do you like this lightning bolt that's in this top left corner? How does it make you feel when you see that? And I was debating, do I want to keep the lightning bolt in here or not? Because I had just sketched it in and I hadn't carved it out yet. And I thought, I'm not sure, but it was also fun to ask my kids, what does that make you feel? Their answers were interesting. And so that did inform me and does.
And I imagine you're getting the raw, honest answers.
That's exactly why. Me of going back to what art teachers try to create in a classroom is a natural critique session with your fellow students. But it's never quite the same as the answers you would probably get from your own children, which are, like you're saying, very honest.
That's kind of an interesting thing I've heard from different artists who've gone to art school, where some people maybe feel a little thrown off for a few years post graduation, in that maybe they showed up at art school with the mindset you're talking about that maybe your children have, and then you come out with this very, okay, you have more education, but you're maybe overthinking certain details and they feel a little more inhibited. So there's kind of that struggle of, okay, you've gone in, you've educated yourself, but then there's also like kind of taking that in, but then letting it go as part of the process. I don't know if that's something you personally struggled with.
I have, absolutely. I think in my early years of trying to form my own, as I would say, voice, I struggled with that. Trying to tap into that very primitive creative self, that creative knowledge that I had in me and we all have in us before we're informed by the world that it's wrong or it's not good enough, that it's not just perfect. And I did struggle with that early on before I felt confident and enough in my skills and my creating a painting that I felt like was representational of what I was feeling inside. And almost like there was that notion of feeling like my work was feeling contrived mostly to me. And I did work through that, and I think the only way I did was I just kept working and kept at it and kept working and worked through all the bad work and kept going and somehow kept the faith that my paintings would get better one day. And they did, thankfully, and my work did, and I'm very comfortable with how I work now in my work. But there was a long period when it was that way, and I think that's a common struggle for many creators. I would almost wonder if you haven't been through some struggle of that sort. The struggle is so much a part of who we are and who we become, and without that, it can mean something quite different, as we spoke of earlier.
So that's basically the advice you would give to any young artists.
I would say yes. Whatever is guiding you, to try and be true to that, even if you feel like what you're creating, you don't love it, or it's not representing how you feel inside, or you're not happy with it, or don't have the skills you wish you had. It's just to remember that drive, that pure drive, and that pure creativity that you have inside of you, and try and remember that and keep going. Just and keep the practice. I would also say that was a pivotal moment for me as an artist when I decided to make a career out of this, and I would not stray from that. And luckily, I am thankful to have a supportive husband who helps to make that happen. Not everyone is lucky in that way, but that disciplined practice is how I got to where I got more comfortable with my style, and I just kept working and working through all the difficulties until I found my own style and my own rhythm, and I stuck with it. Even I had some kind of drive, that instinctual, that I had to keep going forward.
But you found it helpful holding specific hours instead of saying, oh, I'm an artist, like I'll just make whenever I make, dedicating yourself to so and so time.
I really believe in that, actually. For some people, they don't need the specific days. They have the type of life or drive where they can just make that happen and there's no issues. But for me, there are always dishes to do. If you have kids, there are always messes to clean up. There are always kids to take to wherever. And if I didn't carve out that time, I would not have pushed myself through all those hard patches, and I probably would have put it off till the next day or another week, and I wouldn't have worked as much as I have. And that sheer volume of amount of time I have put into my work, that's where I've learned the most, is just I'll keep going and push through and push, and sometimes to a fault. Most of the time it's how I've learned, is just through putting in so much time.
On your blog, you had a post on creativity, and your theory was that it was there, but you were going into just kind of tapping into that.
That's right. I just don't believe that there is not a soul, a human on this planet that's not creative. We were born creative beings, and that can be interpreted in many different ways. That could be the most primitive people have always created. That's how we survive. It was pivotal to our survival. We would create pots because we needed things to eat out of. That's creativity. And sometimes the pots that people were creating would be decorated. Sometimes they wouldn't, but there is a creativity in creating a pot. There is creativity in cooking food for your family at night. You're working in your garden, there's creativity in that. And I've heard so many people say, I'd love to be an artist, but I don't have a creative bone in my body. I just don't agree. Maybe that person hasn't found their right niche or their right genre. Maybe they just need to find the right teacher, the right person to pull that creativity out of them, or they need to find how to do that. It's often just something that they haven't found out how to tap into, but it's there under the surface, and I believe it's what connects all of us. It's
Do you have any shout outs?
Oh, I would love to take a moment to say how grateful I am for the support I've had my whole life. Starting from childhood, my parents always believed in me and never questioned what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be. Never asked me why or how I'm going to get there, but just stood behind me. And I have also had a similar experience in my adulthood, and people that really believe in me and that have gotten behind me. My husband and my family, my children, and my friends. I have a dear community of friends that keep me true to who I am, and they are a mirror to me, and I'm grateful for that.
That support makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. I try to remind myself every day how grateful I am for that, because not everyone is in that position. I try not to take that for granted.
Anyways, thank you so much for joining tonight. Really enjoyed talking to you, and look forward to seeing what comes next for you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Art in the Raw. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Rebecca and that you're feeling inspired. If so, do me a solid like, comment, subscribe, and tell like-minded friends. Keep the inspiration going, and have a good night, y'all.